They shared a shelter in the cold. He didn't know he was now her mate, by sacred law. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind came down hard from the north that night, the kind that made canvas snap against its ropes and carried snow in sideways streaks across the high plains. Elias Garner sat inside his tent pitched against a slab of rock, a rough shelter he had built while trying to mark out the boundaries of the land he meant to claim. He had chosen this stretch near the Colorado-Wyoming line because it was far from towns, far from people, and far from the cavalry posts where men might still remember his face. At 37, he was worn from years that had taken more than they had given. Once a scout, he had spent his time riding ahead of columns, mapping trails, and carrying orders through country that was not his. He had seen raids, burnings, and killings from both sides. Those memories still stuck to him. When the war ended, he had not gone home east. He had no real home left. He stayed on the frontier where silence was thicker and no one asked him questions. His only mission now was to hold this patch of land, raise what he could, and keep to himself. That night, he sat with his coat pulled close, revolver on the ground beside him, and the fire burning low in the small iron pan he used as a stove. He thought about how much wood he had left stacked under the rock shelf, whether it would last through the storm. He thought about the post he still needed to set before winter locked the ground. He thought about how the claim office would not care if a man froze here or not. His chest felt tight the way it often did when the wind picked up, and his mind went to the men he had known who never came back from patrols. He pushed the thoughts down the way he always did. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't match the storm. At first he thought it was only a branch breaking, but there were no trees close. It came again, weaker this time, like someone stumbling against frozen ground. His hand went to the rifle by habit. He sat still, listening. The sound came again. He stood, pulled on his gloves, and stepped out into the night. Snow swept across the ridge, already covering the trail. The cold cut through his coat as he moved away from the tent. At first he saw nothing, only the white blur of snow and the dark line of the hills. Then movement caught his eye, a figure bent low, swaying with each step. He moved closer, rifle raised, ready to warn whoever was off. But when he reached the trail, he saw her clearly. She was young, maybe mid-20s, her hair long and black, strands blown loose from a braid. Her dress was deerskin, once decorated with beads and fringe, now torn and dirt-stained. The neckline stretched low, the fabric split at one shoulder where hands must have grabbed her. She had no shoes. Her bare feet left dark marks in the snow. Her arms were wrapped tight around herself, and her face showed exhaustion deeper than the cold. Elias lowered the rifle, but did not put it away. He felt a sharp pull in his chest. Not fear, not yet trust either, but the knowledge that she would not last another hour out here. He could turn her away, and part of him thought about it. Trouble followed strangers. Trouble followed women cast out like this one seemed to be. He didn't want it, but he couldn't watch her drop into the snow either. He stepped forward, caught her arm before she collapsed fully. Her skin was ice cold through the thin fabric, and she swayed under the pressure of his hand. Her lips moved, and he leaned closer to hear her. "Naeli," she whispered. Her voice was raw, her breath shaking. "Come on," he said, more command than comfort. He pulled her weight against him and guided her up the incline. She stumbled off and, each time dragging harder, but he did not let go. His jaw was tight, his thoughts sharp. If she died in his tent, there would be questions, maybe worse. But leaving her out, there would be no better. Inside, the air felt warmer though the canvas still shook. He sat her near the fire and pulled his blanket from the cot, wrapping it around her shoulders. She pulled it close, but her hands trembled too much to hold it tight. He crouched by the fire, added more wood, and let the flames rise. Now that he saw her clearly in the firelight, her condition struck him harder. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked, her braid half undone. The torn dress left her chest partly bare, and the blanket did little to cover it as she leaned forward, desperate for warmth. He looked away out of instinct, then back again when he saw how her breathing slowed against the heat. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it over. She gripped it with both hands, steadying herself, and drank slow. When she lowered the cup, her eyes met his for the first time. Dark, steady, not pleading, only watching as though measuring what kind of man he was. Elias felt the weight of that look. He knew enough of people cast out or left behind to guess at her story. Apache, likely, and a widow if she was wandering alone like this. Maybe pushed from her band after her husband's death. Maybe worse. He thought about asking, but the tightness in his chest kept him silent. He didn't want the details. Not yet. He set the cup down, leaned back, and reached for his rifle. He rested it across his knees, the way he always did when something unsettled him. She pulled the blanket higher and curled near the fire, her head dropping to her arms as sleep pressed in. Through the night, he stayed half awake, listening to the wind and to her breathing. Each time the fire dimmed, he fed it again. Each time she stirred, he checked to see if she would fall. He told himself it was only caution, nothing more, but deep down he knew that leaving her alive in his tent meant more than survival. He had made a choice, and choices always carried weight. When morning broke pale and gray, she was already awake, sitting upright under the blanket, her eyes steady on him. She did not try to leave. She did not speak. She only looked at him as though the night had already tied them in a way he did not yet understand. The gray morning light filled the tent through the seams of the canvas and carried the smell of smoke and damp wool. Elias had been awake before dawn, as he always was, but he stayed still, his back against the tent pole, watching the woman across the fire. She was sitting up now, the blanket drawn tight around her shoulders, her hair falling in long black strands where the braid had come loose. Her eyes stayed fixed on him in a steady way that made him uneasy, as though she expected something from him that he had not agreed to give. The storm outside had calmed some, but snow still clung to the ridges. Elias knew the land well enough to understand how dangerous the next few days could be. Supplies were thin. He had beans, flour, a little salt pork, and water from the creek nearby, but not much else. With winter setting in, he needed to save every bit. That was his first thought when he saw her still there. That feeding another mouth might mean less for him. But his second thought, heavier, was that she would die if he sent her out now. He could not carry that on his conscience, no matter how much he wanted to stay free of entanglements. He spoke first, his voice quiet. "You understand English?" She nodded once. "Enough." Her tone was low, her accent clear but not harsh. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the night before. "Why were you out there alone?" Her eyes dropped to the fire, her hands tightening on the blanket. "Husband dead. Band no place for me." She paused, choosing each word. "I walk." Elias studied her face. There was no sign of lies, only weariness. He had seen women cast out before, sometimes for being widowed, sometimes for what had happened to them at the hands of soldiers or other men. He felt the familiar tightening in his gut, a mix of pity and anger. He wanted to ask who had torn her dress, who had left her barefoot, but he saw the hard line of her mouth and knew she would not answer. Instead, he asked something else, something practical. "You eaten?" She shook her head. He turned to the saddlebag where he kept food, poured beans into the pan with water, and set it over the fire. While it cooked, he glanced back at her. She had loosened the blanket just enough to warm her hands. Her dress was as bad as he remembered, torn at the neckline, beads dangling loose, the fabric worn thin. He thought about the spare coat he had, rough but whole, and considered offering it. But something in the way she sat told him she would refuse pity if it was offered too openly. The beans boiled slowly. Elias stirred them with the handle of his knife and tried to focus on the fire, but he kept catching her eyes on him. Not fearful, not pleading. Watching, measuring him the way she had the night before. When the food was ready, he pushed the pan toward her. She took it, ate slow, careful not to waste a single bite. When she was finished, she set it down and said, "Thank you." The words sounded simple, but they pressed at him more than he expected. He nodded once and set about filling the water bucket. Stepping outside, he squinted at the snow-crusted ground. The wind had calmed, but the tracks from last night were already fading. He thought about how close she had been to dying there and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. When he came back in, she was standing near the cot, her blanket wrapped close, looking at the rifle propped against the wall. For a moment he tensed, ready to move if she reached for it. But she only looked, then turned her eyes back to him. "You soldier?" she asked. Elias froze for a second. He had not expected the question so soon. He weighed whether to answer, then gave a slow nod. "Scout. Long time ago." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Blue coat." He felt the weight of her meaning. "Union cavalry." The same soldiers who had fought her people, the same kind who had burned villages and driven families from land. His throat tightened, and for the first time since she arrived, he felt real unease. "Yes," he said. His voice was firm, not apologetic. He could not change what he had been. She watched him for a long time, then looked away. "You not wear coat now." Elias let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He realized she was telling him something, that she knew who he had been, but she was judging him for what he was now, not for his past. Still, the silence that followed was heavy. He could feel her grief and suspicion pressing against his own guilt. The day passed in small tasks. Elias showed her where the water bucket was kept, how to keep the fire fed, how to stack wood beneath the overhang to keep it dry. She moved carefully, still weak, but he noticed the steadiness in her hands and the way she wasted no motion. When she bent to set wood, the blanket slipped again, and he caught himself looking away out of respect, but with a pull in his chest that unsettled him. He pushed the thought down hard. As dusk came, Elias stepped outside to check the ridgeline. The sky was red at the edges, snow glowing pale in the fading light. He saw movement far off, 3 riders cutting across the high ground, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. He felt his stomach knot. This was not good country for strangers to be riding so close. When he returned to the tent, Nayeli was mending a tear in the blanket with thread she had found in his kit. She looked up at him, saw the tightness in his face, and asked nothing. He set the rifle across his knees, sat near the flap, and kept his eyes on the darkening ridge. That night, he stayed awake longer than usual. He heard her shift behind him, pulling the blanket tighter, and he thought about what she had said, her husband dead, her band casting her out. He thought about what she hadn't said, who had hurt her, why her dress was torn, how far she had walked barefoot through snow. Questions crowded his mind, but he held them back. Some truths would come later, if she chose. Still, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Responsibility, not the kind that came with orders or scouting. A different weight. The weight of someone else's survival, depending on whether he kept the fire lit, whether he watched the ridge, whether he allowed her to stay. He didn't like the feeling. It reminded him of men he had failed before. But when he looked over his shoulder at her lying close to the fire, her face finally soft with sleep, he knew he would not send her away. By the time the wind shifted and the fire settled into low embers, he had made a decision he would not speak aloud. She would stay here, at least until spring. Trouble or not, stranger or not, he could not go back to the silence he had known the day before. The fire burned low inside the tent, casting weak shadows against the canvas, while outside the wind shifted and carried with it the sound of the plains settling into night. Elias sat at the entrance with a rifle balanced across his knees, his eyes on the ridge line he had studied earlier. The 3 riders he had seen at dusk hadn't come closer, but the memory of them lingered in his mind. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know that men did not ride that country for no reason. Cattle thieves, deserters, or worse. Sometimes men who made their living off the suffering of others. He kept his silence, but the tension was in his shoulders. Behind him, Nayeli stirred. She had taken her place near the fire again, her blanket pulled close, though her eyes followed him instead of sleeping. She had noticed his unease. She had noticed far more than he had said out loud since the moment she arrived. For a long time, she said nothing, and he kept still, listening to the shift of wind, the crack of cooling rock outside, the way the canvas moved against its poles. Finally, she asked quietly, "Men?" Elias didn't turn to face her. He only nodded once. Riders on the ridge. Her lips pressed together, and he saw her shoulders tighten beneath the blanket. "They come here," Not yet. His voice was low and steady, but inside he weighed the risk. If they had seen smoke from his fire, they might circle back. If they guessed he had someone with him, they might test his camp. He thought of how she had looked when he found her, barefoot, dress torn, skin raw from cold, and the idea of those men finding her made his stomach knot. She pulled the blanket closer, but her eyes stayed sharp on him. "You fight them." Elias turned finally, his storm gray eyes steady on hers. "If I have to." He didn't add what ran through his head, that he'd fought enough already, that he carried scars he couldn't scrub clean. He didn't want to raise his rifle again unless it was the last choice. But he knew the plains didn't care about what a man wanted. Survival was never gentle. The hours passed slow. When she finally closed her eyes, he remained where he was, revolver resting on his thigh, forcing himself to stay awake until dawn broke pale across the plains. The riders were gone when the light came, the ridge empty again, but his unease didn't lift. The next morning, Naeli helped gather what little wood was left stacked under the overhang. She moved slower than he did, her body still weak, but he noticed she did not complain, and each time she carried an armful, she stacked it with care, so none would be wasted. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye. He thought about how many listeners or watchers would wonder if she was truly safe with him, a stranger with a soldier's past. He realized he needed to show, not tell, that she had agency in his camp. So when he noticed her glancing at the torn seams of her dress, he spoke. "How about a coat? You want it?" For a moment she hesitated, as if pride held her back, but then she nodded once. He fetched it from the corner, a heavy canvas coat patched at the sleeves. She slipped it on over the deerskin dress, the shoulders too broad, the hem falling almost to her calves, but the relief in her eyes was clear. She looked warmer for the first time since he had found her. "You keep it," he said, matter of fact. "Won't do me harm to go without one indoors." She studied him as though weighing whether he meant it. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Thank you." Elias set to work checking his traps along the ridges, and for the first time since she had arrived, Naeli asked to come along. He considered it, knowing she wasn't strong yet, but decided it was better for her to see the land than to stay alone in the tent if those riders came back. They walked side by side, his stride long, hers shorter but steady. She carried nothing at first, but when he caught a rabbit in one of the snares, she bent to pick it up and held it without complaint. On the trail back, Elias felt her eyes on him. Finally she asked, "Why here? Why alone?" He thought about lying, but he was tired of hiding from words that lived in his chest. "I was a scout. War ended. Didn't want to go back east. Too many faces there I couldn't carry anymore. Here's quiet. Quiet's enough for me." Her gaze stayed on him, unreadable, then dropped to the ground ahead. After a long silence, she said softly, "Quiet is not always enough." The words sat with him the rest of the walk. He wasn't sure if she meant herself, her loneliness, or if she was telling him that his solitude would not protect him forever. Either way, he heard truth in it. Back at camp, she cleaned the rabbit with hands that moved confidently. Elias realized then that listeners would wonder, how much did she really know about survival? Was she helpless, or had she done this before? Watching her work, he saw she was no stranger to hard tasks. She had likely fed herself many times with nothing but scraps. She was not here to be pitied. She was here because she had been given no other choice. That evening, as the fire lit the tent, she sat across from him, the coat draped over her shoulders, the torn dress still visible beneath. She looked at him carefully and asked, "You let me stay? Only winter?" Elias stared at the fire for a long moment. He thought about what it would mean, for food, for risk, for the silence he had chosen for himself. He thought about the riders on the ridge and how he had felt his chest tighten at the thought of them finding her. He thought about the guilt he carried and how heavy it would grow if he sent her out to die. Finally, he said, "You can stay. Winter, spring, as long as you need." For the first time since he had met her, he saw her expression change into something lighter. Not a smile, not yet, but a softening, as though the weight she carried had shifted. She lowered her eyes and nodded. "Then I stay." That night, she slept nearer the fire, her breathing steady. Elias lay back against the pole, eyes open, his mind still restless but steadier than the night before. He knew he had crossed a line without meaning to. She wasn't just a stranger in his camp anymore. She was part of it, and he had accepted that. As he drifted towards sleep, he caught himself thinking of what she had said, quiet is not always enough. He wondered if she was right, and if his years of solitude had only been waiting for something or someone to break it. The next morning began sharp and cold, the kind of air that made lungs ache with every breath. Elias stepped outside the tent early, scanning the ridge lines where he had seen riders the evening before. The horizon was clear now, but he knew better than to trust it. Men did not ride that close for no reason. They would either return, or their presence meant trouble nearby. He stood for a long time, his hand resting on the rifle at his side, weighing whether to move his camp deeper into the hills or stay where the rock overhang gave some shelter. When he returned inside, Naeli was awake, crouched near the fire, feeding it carefully with dry pieces of kindling. She had slipped his coat on again, the blanket draped over her lap. Her hair was loose, falling around her shoulders, and she looked stronger than she had when he first found her. She glanced at him, then back to the fire, her movements steady, almost practiced. For the first time, she seemed less like a stranger clinging to life and more like someone who meant to stand her ground. Elias poured water into the pan, set it over the flames, and glanced her way. We'll need more food soon. Beans won't last long. She nodded, then surprised him by saying, I can trap rabbits. Skin them. I do before. Her English was broken but clear, her voice certain. He studied her, trying to judge if she had the strength yet. Listeners would have wondered the same thing. How capable was she, or was she only surviving by chance? The truth was clearer now. She knew the work of survival. She had done it before, and she was offering it again, not as a plea, but as contribution. Elias gave a short nod. All right, we'll go after breakfast. As they ate, Naeli asked quietly, You alone here a long time? Since spring, Elias answered. Claimed the ground. Put up posts. No one else around. She looked at him steadily. No wife. No children. The question tightened his chest. He had expected it eventually. He shook his head. No, just me. He did not explain further, but the silence that followed seemed to tell her enough, that he had chosen solitude not out of preference alone, but because there was no one waiting for him anywhere else. They left the tent together after the meal, walking along the frozen ridges. Elias carried the rifle, keeping his eyes on the land, while Naeli carried a bundle of twine and small sticks she had gathered from his supplies. He realized some listeners might have wondered how she survived barefoot until now. He had given her spare boots the day before, stuffing them with cloth so they would fit better, and though they were still loose, she walked with more ease. They set snares near a thicket where tracks crossed the snow. Naeli moved with quiet efficiency, her hands quick as she looped the twine and set it against the ground. Elias watched, silently acknowledging that she was not helpless here. She had knowledge he could use. When they finished, she brushed the snow from her hands and stood close, her breath showing in the air. On the way back, she asked suddenly, The men last night, they come back? Elias kept his eyes forward. Could be. Don't know yet. She was quiet for a moment, then said, If they come, I fight too. The words made him stop in his tracks. He turned to her, his jaw tight. You don't need to. That's my part. Her eyes narrowed. Your part, my part. Both want live. I fight. He studied her, torn between admiration and worry. He knew she was right, but the thought of her standing with a weapon against armed men made his stomach knot. He didn't answer, only started walking again, faster this time, and she followed without another word. That night, they sat by the fire, the smell of rabbit meat filling the tent from the snares they had checked that afternoon. Elias cleaned his rifle, while Naeli worked the hide with steady hands. For a moment, it almost felt like a household, not a camp thrown up against the storm. Yet he knew the question still hung between them. What bound them together beyond survival? As she finished with the hide, she spoke softly, almost as if she hadn't meant to say it aloud. My people, law says, woman share fire, share tent, she belonged to man. Her eyes stayed on the hide, Not on him. You know this. Elias froze. He had suspected something of the sort, had seen enough bands live by rules he didn't fully understand, but hearing it spoken brought the weight down heavy. His mind ran quick. Was that why she had looked at him so steady each morning? Was that why she did not speak of leaving? He cleared his throat. I didn't know. Now she raised her eyes to him, dark and steady. But I know. I stay because law says, but also because I want. You take me in. You keep me alive. He felt his throat tighten. He had not asked for this, had not thought of himself as anyone's keeper, but the truth was plain. She was here, and he had chosen not to send her away. He looked at her for a long time, the firelight catching the curve of her face, the rough, torn edges of her dress under the coat, the steadiness of her gaze. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Responsibility, yes, but also something heavier, something closer to belonging. Outside, the wind pressed against the canvas again, and Elias shifted the rifle closer. If those riders come back, they'll find her not easy to take from. Naeli gave a small nod, her hands still, her eyes on his. Then we stand. That night, when the fire burned low, Elias lay awake longer than he meant to. He thought about what she had said, about the law of her people, about choice, about staying. He realized that the silence he had carried for years was no longer his alone. She had stepped into it, claimed part of it for herself. And whether by law or by choice, she was no longer just a stranger at his fire. The morning came hard and bright after a night of restless sleep. Elias pushed the flap of the tent open and scanned the ridges again, his breath showing in white bursts. The ground was frozen solid, and the tracks they had made the day before had already faded under thin layers of snow swept in by the wind. For a moment, the land looked calm, but calm could not be trusted. He remembered the three riders, their outlines sharp against the horizon, and he knew the question listeners might ask. Who were those men, and what did they want? He didn't have an answer yet, but he intended to be ready if they came back. Inside, Naeli was crouched near the fire, rolling the rabbit hide she had worked the night before into a neat bundle. The coat he had given her was still too large, but she had tied it close with a strip of leather to keep it steady on her shoulders. Her hair was braided again, tighter this time, and her face carried less of the exhaustion that had marked her when he first found her. She looked up when he stepped back inside, her eyes steady. They come again? She asked. Not this morning, Elias replied. He set his rifle against the pole and crouched by the fire to warm his hands. But they might. Men like that don't ride for nothing. She stayed quiet, but he could see in her eyes that she was thinking the same thing, that if the riders were watching, they might return at any moment, and two people in a canvas tent were easy prey. Elias thought about it carefully. Listeners would wonder why he didn't move the camp, why he stayed exposed. The truth was simple. The rock overhang gave him shelter from the worst winds, and the creek nearby gave him water. Moving now, in the heart of winter, would mean more risk than staying put. But he knew he had to prepare. He spoke as he stirred the fire. If trouble comes, you stay behind me. Don't stand in the open. Her chin lifted slightly. I told you, I fight too. Elias met her gaze. He saw not just defiance, but also fear tucked beneath it. He wanted to tell her no again, but part of him knew the truth. If trouble reached their camp, she would not sit idle. He sighed, rubbed his hands over his face, and said, all right, but you follow my lead. Later, they walked to check the snares. The cold bit through the air, and Elias noticed she moved slower now, her boots slipping slightly in the crusted snow. He tightened the cloth inside them that evening, adjusting them so they fit better, answering another unspoken question. How could she walk in boots so big for her? Now they fit more firmly, though still not perfectly. When they reached the thicket, two of the snares held rabbits. Naeli crouched low, working quickly with practiced hands. Elias watched, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and felt something he hadn't in years, a faint sense of partnership. They were surviving together, not as strangers, but as two people with shared purpose. Back at the tent, while she prepared the meat, Elias found himself studying her in the firelight. He thought about what she had said the night before, that sharing a fire, sharing a tent, made her bound to him by her people's law. Listeners would want to know what he thought about that, whether he accepted it or resisted it. The truth was complicated. He hadn't asked for a mate, hadn't wanted ties after years of solitude. But each time he looked at her, strong-willed, scarred by grief, yet steady in her presence, he felt the pull of something he had buried long ago. That night, as they ate, Naeli asked another question. You stay here after winter? Or you leave? Elias wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stared into the flames. I stay. I put down posts, mark land. Make it mine. She tilted her head, considering his words. You want home? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, a place that's mine, where no one can tell me where to go, what to fight for. He didn't add that he had been running from ghosts, from memories that followed him, but she seemed to understand without him saying it. You make home, she said quietly. I help. Her words were simple, but they struck him hard. He hadn't thought about anyone else in his plan, hadn't pictured another person driving posts or mending fences beside him. Yet here she was, offering it without hesitation. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. The fire crackled, and silence settled between them. But it was not the heavy silence of strangers. It was a quieter one, filled with understanding. Elias leaned back against the pole, rifle across his knees as always, and let himself rest for the first time in days. That night, long after she had drifted into sleep, he sat awake again, watching the fire burn down. He thought about the riders, about the law she believed bound them, about the idea of home. He realized he had already made another decision without speaking it aloud. He would not let anyone take her from his camp, no matter who came down from the ridges. And with that thought, for the first time in years, Elias felt something close to calm. The storm that had carried snow across the ridges had passed, leaving the plains strangely quiet under a pale sky. Elias rose early, his instincts sharper than usual, and stepped out of the tent with a rifle slung over his shoulder. The cold air pressed against his skin, and in the distance, the ridges cut dark lines against the horizon. At first, nothing moved, but then he saw them, 3 riders again, further down this time, moving slow, their figures clear in the early light. They weren't just passing, they were watching. Elias stood still, his jaw tightening. Listeners might have wondered why these men mattered so much, whether they were truly a threat or only drifters. He knew the difference. Drifters rode through. These men circled like coyotes, waiting to see if there was something worth taking. He turned back toward the tent, where the firelight still glowed faint through the canvas. Inside, Naeli was crouched near the pan, stirring beans with a wooden spoon. She looked up as he entered, and she knew from his face before he said anything. Men, she stated. They're back, Elias confirmed. He set the rifle down only long enough to pour water into a cup, his mind already working through what had to be done. They're close enough now. They've seen the camp. She studied him carefully, then asked, You fight them now, or you wait? Elias didn't answer right away. He thought about what people would wonder. Why not pack and leave? Why not avoid the fight? He had weighed that already. Moving camp meant hauling supplies in deep snow, no cover, no shelter. They would be exposed, and the riders would trail them anyway. Staying here gave them at least one advantage: the rock shelf at their backs, the tent for cover, and his traps close by. He finally said, We hold here. If they mean trouble, they'll show it. The day dragged, every sound outside pulling Elias's hand toward the rifle. He kept watch while Naeli worked inside the tent, mending seams on the blanket with a needle she found in his kit. At one point, she looked at him and asked, You kill before? He met her eyes steadily. Yes. His voice was blunt, carrying no pride. In the war. On the plains. Too many times. She nodded slowly, as though confirming what she already guessed. And now, you kill again if they come. His throat felt tight, but he forced himself to answer. If I have to keep us alive. That evening, as the sky turned red and the wind dropped, Elias checked the ridges again. The riders were gone from view, but he knew better than to trust the silence. He loaded his rifle carefully, then checked the revolver, every motion deliberate. Naeli watched him from the fire, her expression unreadable. Finally, she asked, Why you held me that night? You could leave me. He stopped, looking down at the weapon in his hands. He hadn't expected the question so direct, but he knew the listeners would have wondered the same thing. Why did he take her in when trouble followed her? He spoke slow. I thought about it, walking past, but I've seen too many left in the dirt. I wasn't going to add another. Her eyes softened at that, though her jaw remained tight. Then I was right, she said quietly. You are not like them. They ate in silence, but the weight of her words stayed with him. Elias lay awake long after the fire had burned low, rifle across his knees, watching shadows shift against the canvas. It was past midnight when the sound came. Horses moving slow, hooves crunching against frozen ground. Elias sat up straight, heart pounding but steady, and motioned to Nayeli without a word. She slipped closer to the back of the tent, her blanket pulled tight, but her eyes did not show fear. They showed readiness. The voices outside were low at first, then sharper. A fire here, I told you, one man muttered. Another voice answered, rough with drink. Let's see what's inside. Elias's pulse slowed the way it always had before a fight. He lifted the flap just enough to see the figures. 3 men on horseback dismounting now, moving toward the tent. Their coats were ragged, their faces shadowed, rifles hanging loose but ready. These are not ranchers or scouts. They were men looking for an easy mark. He whispered back to Nayeli, stay low. Then he rose, pushing out of the tent with his rifle in plain view. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his voice carrying steady through the cold. That's far enough. The men stopped, surprised to see him already waiting. One smirked, spat into the snow, and said, didn't know you had company out here. Thought maybe we'd warm ourselves by your fire. You're not welcome here, Elias said flatly. His finger rested near the trigger, though he didn't raise the barrel yet. The second man stepped forward. We don't mean harm, just looking for shelter. Food, maybe. His eyes, though, flicked past Elias toward the tent, and Elias knew what he was really after. He shifted his stance, blocking the view, his voice hardening. You've got 2 choices. Turn back now, or you'll regret coming closer. The silence stretched, the men testing him with their eyes. Nayeli watched from inside, her hand gripping the handle of the knife Elias had left by the pan. She didn't move, but she was ready. Finally, the first man laughed, sharp and mean. Not tonight, maybe, but we'll be back. He swung up onto his horse, the others following. They rode off into the dark, leaving only tracks in the snow. Elias stood still long after they were gone, his breath clouding in the night. When he stepped back inside, Nayeli's eyes were fixed on him. They come back, she said, her voice calm but certain. Yes, Elias answered. He set the rifle down, his shoulders heavy. And next time, they won't stop at talking. She studied him in the firelight, her face steady. Then we stand together. He looked at her long, the weight of her words settling deep. She wasn't only a woman he had taken in by chance anymore. She was choosing this place, choosing him despite the danger. And he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't preparing to face trouble alone. The night after the riders' visit weighed heavier than the storm had. Elias kept his rifle across his knees until the fire burned low, his eyes fixed on the flap of the tent, his ears straining for hoofbeats that never came. Beside him, Nayeli had curled under the blanket, her breathing steady but shallow, as though she too listened through her sleep. He knew she was not resting any easier than he was. The plains did not forgive weakness, and both of them had been marked by too many years of it. By dawn, he stepped outside, boots crunching over frozen ground, and checked the ridges again. The snow had thinned, but tracks cut deep across the rise, proof the riders had circled longer than they had shown. He squatted low, running his hand over the prints, his jaw tightening. They had stopped, watched, maybe argued among themselves. They would be back. He felt it in his chest, as much as he saw it in the snow. When he returned, Nayeli was already awake, crouched by the fire, turning the last of the beans in the pan. She looked up, reading his face before he spoke. They come again, she said flatly. He nodded. Sooner or later. She studied him carefully, then asked, how many bullets you have? Elias blinked at her bluntness, then sat down, laying the rifle across his lap. Listeners might have wondered the same thing. Was he prepared? Did he even have enough to stand a fight? He pulled open the pouch at his belt. 9 for the rifle. 6 in a revolver, 12 more loose. He snapped it shut. Not much, but enough. Her eyes didn't waver. Enough if we stand together. Through the day, they prepared. Elias cut more wood, hauling it beneath the rock overhang. Nayeli walked with him, wrapping his coat tight around her shoulders, carrying smaller loads, but refusing to stay behind. He noticed her strength had grown, less stumbling, more steady steps. They checked the snares and caught another rabbit. This time, she cleaned it with quick precision while Elias sharpened the knife and checked the seams of the tent for weaknesses. That evening, Elias showed her how to hold the revolver. He hadn't planned to. He had told himself he would keep her out of it, but the memory of the rider's eyes scanning toward the tent stayed with him. He couldn't leave her without a chance. He unloaded it, showed her the weight, the sight, the way to keep her wrist steady. Her hands were small against the metal, but she listened closely, practicing the motions until he was satisfied she understood. Only if there's no other choice, he said firmly. She nodded once, eyes serious. I know. Night came fast, the sky bruised purple, and with it came the sound they both dreaded. Horses again, closer this time, the steady beat of hooves crunching snow. Elias's pulse steadied, his body moving on instinct as he checked the rifle, motioned Nayeli to the back of the tent, and crouched low by the entrance. The voices were clearer now, no longer hushed. There it is, the fire. A man's laugh, sharp and mean. Tommy had a look inside. Another answered. Elias lifted the flap just enough to see them. 3 men again, dismounting, rifles in hand. Their faces were clearer now. Rough beards, weathered coats, eyes scanning with hunger. Not men lost. Predators. He stepped out slow, rifle raised, his voice even. That's far enough. The leader sneered. We gave you a chance last night. Should have shared what you had. Now we'll take it. Elias kept his stance steady. You step closer, you won't walk away. The man's grin widened. You think one man in a camp can stop us? His eyes flicked past Elias toward the tent again, and Elias felt heat rise in his chest. He shifted slightly, blocking their line of sight. Behind him, Nayeli had stayed low, the revolver in her hands. Her heart hammered, but her grip was firm. She remembered what Elias had shown her. She remembered, too, what had been done to her before. The rough hands that had torn her dress. The men who had cast her out. This time, she would not stand helpless. The standoff stretched, snow crunching under boots as the riders shifted forward. Elias's voice came out hard. Last warning. Turn back. The leader lifted his rifle. Or what? The crack of Elias's shot shattered the night. The bullet struck the snow at the man's feet, spraying frost. For a heartbeat, silence hung. Then chaos broke. The riders lunged forward, rifles raised, shouting. Elias fired again, hitting one man in the arm and spinning him back with a cry. The others dropped low, firing toward the tent. Bullets tore through canvas, the firelight flickering against smoke and powder. Inside, Nayeli stayed low, her ears ringing. But when one man broke from cover and rushed the tent, she raised the revolver the way Elias had shown her and fired. The shot echoed, louder than she expected, but it struck the ground near his boots, enough to stop him cold. Elias came around fast, driving the butt of his rifle into the man's chest, dropping him hard into the snow. The fight was short, brutal. 2 shots more, and the riders pulled back, one clutching his arm, another dragging the fallen man toward the horses. They cursed, shouted, and retreated into the dark, the sound of hooves fading fast into the ridges. Elias stood breathing hard, smoke rising from his rifle, his ears ringing. He scanned the ridge until he was sure they were gone. Then he turned back to the tent. Nayeli stood there, revolver in both hands, her chest rising and falling, eyes wide but steady. You did good, he said, his voice rough. Her hands trembled now that it was over, but she lowered the weapon and met his eyes. We stand, she said quietly. He nodded, the weight of the moment settling into him. She had stood with him, and together they had held the ground. For the first time in years, Elias felt the meaning of more than survival. He felt the edge of something stronger, belonging, not just for himself, but for both of them. The night after the gunfight carried a different weight inside the tent. Smoke from spent powder still clung to their clothes, and the canvas walls bore the scars of holes torn by stray bullets. Elias sat against the pole with the rifle across his lap, cleaning it carefully, his movements deliberate, steadying himself through the routine. His jaw was tight, and though his hands were sure, his mind kept circling back to the fight. Every shot fired, every step the riders had taken toward the tent. He knew they had driven them off, but he also knew men like that rarely gave up after losing face. They would be back, or others would hear of a lone camp with supplies worth stealing. Nayeli sat near the fire, wrapped in the coat, the revolver beside her on the ground. Her hand still trembled slightly when she reached for the pan, though she hid it well. She had stood with him, just as she promised. She had not broken under the gunfire, and when she had pulled the trigger, her eyes had not shut. But now that silence had returned, the weight of what they had done pressed on her. She looked at Elias finally and asked in a low voice, "They come again?" He met her eyes. "Maybe not tonight, but yes, they'll try again." She nodded once, as though she already knew, then asked a second question that had been waiting in her since the fight. "You kill before, you kill again. You sleep after?" Elias paused, the rifle in his hands, still for the first time since he'd begun cleaning. He thought about how many times listeners would have wondered this too, how a man lived with what he had done, whether he carried guilt or buried it. He let out a breath and answered plainly, "I don't sleep easy, but I do what I have to. That's the truth of it." Her gaze stayed on him, long and steady, then softened. "You keep me alive. That is enough." The word struck him more than he expected. He felt something in his chest loosen, though his shoulders stayed tense. He set the rifle aside and leaned back against the pole. For years, no one had looked at him with anything but suspicion or fear. Now, in this torn canvas tent, a woman who had lost everything spoke to him as though his choices still carried worth. The following day, they worked harder than before. Elias reinforced the tent seams with spare canvas, patching the holes where bullets had torn through. Nayeli helped, stitching carefully, her hands steady despite the cold. Together, they stacked more wood and checked the snares again, knowing they needed to be prepared for both hunger and danger. At one point, Elias found himself watching her while she bent over the hide she was scraping. Her hair had slipped loose, her braid undone, falling across her shoulders. The coat he had given her was still far too big, but the way she worked, calm and sure, made her presence feel less like a burden and more like something steady at his side. He realized then that listeners might wonder if she stayed only because of the law she had spoken of, that sharing a tent bound her. He knew now it was more than that. She stayed because she had chosen to, because she believed in him enough to fight beside him. That evening, as the fire warmed the small space, she broke the silence with a question that had lingered unspoken since she arrived. "Your family? You say no wife, no children. But before, what you leave behind?" Elias froze. He had avoided this from the start, but he knew it was something anyone would ask. He ran his thumb along the stock of the rifle before answering. "A farm back east. Parents gone when I was young. A brother once, but he stayed behind. When I came west with the army, I never went back. I didn't have much waiting for me." He lifted his eyes to hers, steady. "The men I rode with, the ones who didn't live, sometimes I think I left them behind more than anyone else." Nayeli listened without interrupting, her face solemn. Then she said softly, "I know that. I leave my husband in the ground. My band walk away from me after. I carry them still, but not with me. It is same." Her words pulled a quiet from him that was heavier than before, but not unwelcome. For the first time, he felt not just pity for her losses, but recognition of something shared. They were two people carrying ghosts, both left outside the lives they once had. As the fire burned lower, their silence shifted again, no longer sharp but warmer. He sat closer than he usually did, close enough to feel the brush of her shoulder when she shifted the blanket. She did not move away. Where her hand brushed his as she passed the cup, neither of them pulled back. It was not a grand gesture, not even spoken, but it carried the weight of something neither had allowed themselves to reach for in years. Outside, the plains stretched cold and dangerous, but inside the tent, the bond between them tightened. They had fought together, bled fear together, and now sat side by side, not as strangers, but as something more, something unspoken but certain. Before sleep, Elias checked the rifle one more time, then looked at her. "If they come again, we'll be ready." Naeli held his gaze, her voice steady. "We are already ready, because we stand." He nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening, not quite a smile, but closer than he had come in years. For the first time, he believed her. The morning after the fight fell sharper, the air biting hard, as if to remind them the night had been real and not some half-remembered nightmare. Elias stepped out of the tent at first light, scanning the ridge lines with his rifle slung over his shoulder. The snow was cut with fresh tracks, hoof marks pressed deep, running off toward the southern trail. The riders had left in a hurry, but their prints showed they hadn't gone far before circling again. He knew, and Naeli likely knew as well, that they weren't finished. When he came back inside, she was awake, crouched near the fire, stirring what little beans remained in the pan. Her face was calmer than the night before, but her eyes watched him close. "They come?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded once. "They'll try again. Can't let it hang over us any longer." She set the spoon down and straightened, wrapping the coat tighter around her shoulders. "Then we finish it." Elias studied her, hearing not just determination, but acceptance. She had no illusions about what was coming. Listeners might have asked by now why they didn't flee, why they didn't pack what they could and disappear into the hills. The answer was simple. Running meant no shelter, no fire, no chance to defend what little they had built. Standing meant risk, but it also meant claiming something as their own. Elias had spent years drifting, never planting roots, never calling anything his. But looking at Naeli across the fire, he realized he was ready to stand, not only for himself, but for her too. Through the day, they prepared. Elias cut branches and dragged them near the tent, forming a barrier that would slow horses if the riders tried to charge in. Naeli helped stack the wood higher and gathered stones near the fire pit. At one point she asked, "How many bullets left?" He answered plainly, 5 for the rifle, 6 for the revolver, and some loose. He knew it wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As dusk came, the sound they had both expected arrived. Hooves pounding against the frozen earth, voices carrying sharper than before. 3 riders again, coming fast, rifles already raised. Elias crouched low by the flap, steadying his breath, while Naeli took her place near the fire, revolver gripped in both hands just as he had taught her. The men didn't circle this time. They came straight for the camp. Shots cracked, ripping through the canvas. Elias fired back, the first bullet striking a rider's horse and sending it rearing. The man toppled into the snow with a shout. Naeli held steady, her revolver shaking in her hands but aimed true. When one of the men pushed forward on foot, she fired, the shot grazing his arm and forcing him back. The leader charged closest, shouting curses, his rifle raised. Elias met him head-on, stepping into the open and firing point-blank. The shot dropped him into the snow, his weapon clattering from his hands. The other 2, wounded and shaken, dragged him up and scrambled back to their horses. In moments, the sound of hooves faded down the ridge, leaving only silence and the stink of powder in the air. Elias stood, breathing hard, rifle still in his grip. His chest burned, his shoulders heavy. But as he scanned the ridges, he knew it was over. Men like that didn't come back once beaten and bloodied. They'd find easier prey somewhere else. When he stepped back inside, Naeli was still crouched near the fire, the revolver lowered now, her hands trembling in the aftermath. She looked up at him, her eyes wide but steady. "They go. They're gone," he said, his voice rough but certain. For a long moment, silence filled the tent. Then she let out a slow breath, set the revolver aside, and whispered, "We live." Elias crouched near her, his hand brushing against hers as he reached for the pan by the fire. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand and held his. It was the first time either of them had allowed that closeness without hesitation. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Not just that night in the snow. Tonight, too." He looked at her, the firelight catching her face, the braid that had slipped loose, the the strength in her eyes. For years, he had kept his distance, had refused to let anyone close enough to matter. But now, with her hand in his, with the memory of the fight still burning in his chest, he knew he couldn't send her away. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice firm, steady. "Not after this. This is your home now, same as mine." Her lips parted slightly, her eyes softening. "Then we stay. Together." The words carried more weight than any law, more than the sacred binding she had spoken of before. This was choice, plain and simple, spoken by both of them. That night, they sat close by the fire, their shoulders touching, the silence no longer heavy but warm. Outside, the plains stretched wide and cold, but inside the tent, they had claimed something stronger than fear. By morning, the camp was quiet again, the ridges empty, and the land theirs to keep. Elias looked at the post he had set in the spring, at the fire still burning, at the woman who now moved beside him with certainty. For the first time since he had come west, he felt the weight of roots settling into the ground. He had a home, and he was no longer alone.